Jake Carter had dealt with murderers, thieves, and gang members in his law enforcement career, but none of them had prepared him for Karen Whitmore. He had moved into the neighborhood less than a month ago, looking for a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. A nice house, a good yard for his dog, and a chance to relax. But Karen had other plans. Jake was woken up at 6:45 a.m. by frantic knocking at his front door, the kind of knock that makes you think someone's either reporting a crime or demanding a hostage. Still half asleep, coffee in hand, he opened the door, only to find Karen Whitmore standing there, clipboard in hand, flanked by two men in cheap uniforms. Karen smirked. "Mr. Carter," she announced, like she was sentencing him to death, "you are in violation of HOA regulations." Jake blinked. "I am?" Karen huffed dramatically, flipping through her papers. "Your grass is exactly 3.2 inches high. The limit is 3 inches. Jake just stared. The two HOA officers behind her nodded sternly, gripping their clipboards like they were SWAT team leaders on a mission. Jake took a long, slow sip of his coffee. Then he sighed. "You're telling me," he said, "that you dragged two grown men to my house because my grass is barely a quarter-inch too high?" Karen smirked. "Rules are rules." Jake had seen Karen around before. She patrolled the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand. She reported people for minor violations like leaving trash cans out 30 seconds too long. She once fined a neighbor for parking their truck half an inch over the driveway line. And now she had brought her personal HOA police forces to his house thinking he'd roll over. Jake folded his arms. "What happens if I don't pay this?" "Fine." Karen's smirk grew. "Then we escalate it to the HOA board," she said smugly. "If you refuse to comply, we take legal action. You could be looking at serious consequences." The HOA officers nodded in unison, trying to look intimidating. Jake exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. And then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out something that changed everything. His sheriff's badge. Karen's smug expression froze. The HOA officers stiffened. Jake held up the badge just enough for them to see. "See, Karen," he said slowly, "I deal with actual criminals every day." Karen swallowed hard. The HOA officers shifted awkwardly. Jake took a step forward, lowering his voice. "But you think I'm going to lose sleep over an extra millimeter of grass?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Jake wasn't done. "I did some digging into HOA regulations," he said. "Did you know that falsely fining homeowners for violations that aren't real could be considered fraud?" Karen's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Jake smirked. "You sure? Because I'm thinking of launching a little investigation." The two HOA officers immediately stepped away from Karen. One of them even dropped his clipboard. Karen panicked. We'll discuss this later," she muttered, shoving her papers into the officer's hands before speed-walking down the driveway. The officers followed her, looking deeply uncomfortable. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the moment. But as he turned back inside, his phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA board. Jake opened it, already knowing who was behind it. The lawn violation was listed. Improper trash bin placement was added. And the best part? They were now accusing him of having a disruptive attitude toward HOA enforcement officers. Jake rubbed his temples. Karen wasn't backing down. She was doubling down. Which meant only one thing. Jake was going to dig deeper. And what he found? It would bring Karen's entire kingdom crashing down. Karen Whitmore had poked the wrong bear. Jake Carter wasn't just some random homeowner. He was a sheriff, trained to sniff out lies, corruption, and abuse of power. And Karen, she was hiding something. After Jake's little show and tell with his sheriff's badge, Karen should have backed off. Instead, she doubled down. He got 3 more violation notices that same week. A letter arrived claiming his front porch light was too bright, as if that was a real rule. He even caught an HOA officer sneaking around his yard with a tape measure. They were desperate to make his life miserable. Which meant one thing: Karen was hiding something big, and Jake was going to find it. Jake spent his next day off, digging into the HOA records. He pulled up public financial reports. He checked past lawsuits and complaints. He dug into Karen's history as president. And what he found? It was even worse than he expected. Karen had been running the HOA like her own little kingdom for years. Suspicious fines were issued, but never properly documented. Payments from residents disappeared into accounts no one could trace. Contractors were paid for neighborhood improvements that never actually happened. But the biggest bombshell? Karen had personally approved a $40,000 landscaping project last year. The money? Gone. No invoices, no records of work being done. Jake leaned back in his chair, letting out a low whistle. "Oh, Karen," he muttered. "You're a crook." After digging through the paperwork, Jake decided to go straight to the source. The neighbors. He started talking to other homeowners, asking if they'd had problems with the HOA. Mr. Thompson down the street. Fined $500 for having a non-regulation. Mailbox, the Johnsons, charged $200 for an unauthorized fence that was there when they moved in. An elderly widow, Mrs. Holloway. She'd been threatened with foreclosure over unpaid fees she never agreed to. And every single time, the money went through Karen. Jake gritted his teeth. This wasn't just petty HOA nonsense. This was fraud, and Karen was at the center of it. Jake knew that just exposing the truth wasn't enough. Karen would lie, deflect, play the victim. So he needed to catch her red-handed. That's when he got an idea. At the next HOA meeting, he would drop the bombshell in front of everyone, with witnesses, with documents. And if all went according to plan, Karen wouldn't just lose her position, she'd lose everything. Jake Carter had spent years watching criminals panic when they realized the game was over. But nothing could compare to the absolute meltdown Karen Whitmore was about to have. Because tonight, Jake was bringing receipts, and Karen's little HOA kingdom was about to fall. The HOA clubhouse was packed. Board members sat stiffly at the front table. Karen perched in the middle, smug as ever. Homeowners filled every chair, muttering about their latest finds. Karen cleared her throat. "Let's begin," she said, adjusting her glasses. "First, I'd like to discuss our plans for—" Jake stood up. Karen paused, eyes narrowing. "Yes, Mr. Carter," she asked sweetly, fake smile plastered on. Jake pulled out a thick folder and walked to the front. "I think we need to talk about where the HOA money is really going." The room went dead silent. Jake set the folder down on the table, right in front of Karen. "Last year," he said, flipping the first page, "the HOA approved a $40,000 landscaping project." Karen nodded quickly. "Yes, and—" Jake held up a hand. "But here's the problem." He flipped another page. "There are no invoices, no receipts, no proof that any work was ever done." The homeowner started murmuring. Karen's smile tightened. "Well," she said, forcing a chuckle, "perhaps the records weren't uploaded properly." Jake dropped another stack of papers on the table. "These are bank statements," he continued. "Every HOA payment funnels through one account." He tapped the document, but $40,000 was transferred to a private account. Karen's face lost color. Jake leaned in. An account registered under your name. The room exploded. Are you serious? She stole from us? My God, I knew something was fishy. Karen shot to her feet. This is an outrage! Jake didn't even blink. Oh, there's more. He flipped another page. Mr. Thompson, fined $500 for a non-regulation mailbox. Thompson, an elderly man in the front row, crossed his arms. That fine almost made me move. Jake pointed at Karen, but the fine was never recorded in HOA documents. Karen's jaw twitched. Jake turned to Mrs. Holloway, the widow who had been threatened with foreclosure. She was charged $3,000 in missed fees. Jake tapped the papers. But those fees didn't exist. Karen snapped. Enough! She screamed. She grabbed the papers and flung them to the floor. This is a witch hunt! She shrieked. I have done nothing wrong! Jake pulled out his final piece of evidence, a USB drive. This contains audio, recordings of HOA meetings, he said, including one where you, he smirked, admit to creating fake violations to boost HOA revenue. Karen's face contorted in horror. Nancy, the HOA vice president, stood up slowly. Karen, she said, voice shaking with rage. Is this true? Karen opened her mouth, then closed. Jake smirked. It doesn't really matter, he said, because the sheriff's department already has copies. Karen stumbled back. Wait, she whispered. You gave this to the authorities? Jake flashed his badge. What, do you think? Nancy turned to the board. I motion to remove Karen Whitmore as HOA president, effective immediately. Second, someone yelled. The board unanimously voted her out, on the spot. Karen let out a strangled gasp. You can't do this, she screeched. I built this HOA! Jake grinned. And now you're banned from it. As Karen was escorted out by security, the entire neighborhood cheered. Jake turned to Nancy. Next step? He asked. Nancy nodded. We go through all HOA finances, refund stolen money, and remove Karen's insane rules. Jake smirked. Sounds like a plan. And for the first time, the neighborhood finally had peace. Karen Whitmore had spent years controlling the neighborhood like a queen on a throne. She fined people for nonsense. She bullied residents into paying fake fees. She thought she was untouchable, but now she was jobless, disgraced, and on the verge of criminal charges. And Jake Carter? He was about to make sure she never messed with anyone again. The very next day, the new HOA board sent out an official email. HOA notice. Immediate changes. All unfair fines voided. All fake fees. Refunds on the way. Karen's insane rules deleted from existence. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. People pulled their trash cans to the curb in victory. One guy set up a 10-foot inflatable Santa in April just because he could. A woman threw a No More Karen block party, complete with a dunk tank. And Karen, she locked herself inside her house, blinds drawn, refusing to face the neighborhood she had terrorized. Jake wasn't done. He had the evidence. He had the victims. And he had one final message for Karen. So, one afternoon, he knocked on her door. It took 5 minutes before she finally cracked it open. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her once perfectly styled hair? A mess. What do you want? She snapped. Jake smirked. Oh, just wanted to let you know, he said, holding up a legal document. Your fraud case? It's officially under review. Karen's face went white. You wouldn't, she whispered. Jake raised an eyebrow. Oh, I would. He leaned in. You stole from people, Karen. You lied, cheated, and threatened good people just to feel powerful. And now—" He handed her the papers. "It's time to face the consequences." Karen snatched the papers, her hands shaking. "This isn't fair," she screeched. "I was just doing what's best for the community." Jake chuckled. "The community disagrees." Karen opened her mouth, then slammed the door in his face. 2 weeks later, Karen officially resigned from the HOA and moved out of the neighborhood. She sold her house in a panic. She disappeared without saying goodbye. And no one, not a single person, missed her. Jake. He kicked back on his porch, watching his dog Max chase squirrels, enjoying the peaceful life he had fought for. No more pointless fines. No more HOA police. No more Karen. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated. Your support means the world.